Firing squad. If you have an idea of how a game of Russian roulette is played, you already have a clear image of a firing squad. Except instead of a gun and bullet, it's 10 to 15 soldiers firing at you all at once while you are blindfolded and restrained. It's the ultimate team building exercise that absolutely nobody wants an invite to. Believe it or not, back in the day, the firing squad was the go-to death penalty. It was brutally efficient, quick, cheap, and straight to the point. Literally. Let's just say it's one appointment you're definitely not going to be late for, or survive for that matter. However, while it sounds simple in theory, a lot of things usually go wrong, like misfire, bad aim, or a really unfortunate bounce back from a bullet, which leaves a painfully messy and traumatic scene. This is the kind of chaos that sparked controversy over firing squads in the 20th century, because honestly, it sounds like something out of an old school war movie rather than a modern justice system. Critics argued that firing squads are so last century and should have been left back in the dusty saloon days. Plus, having an entire squad fire at one unarmed person feels a bit like bringing a tank to a snowball fight. Serious overkill. Even some psychology experts jumped in on the matter, criticizing the fact that governments across the world who use firing squads do not even consider the emotional and psychological trauma inflicted on the relatives of the criminals, which makes the punishment way more inhumane. So, countries like the US, UK, Italy, and many others decided to part ways with the firing squad, but in countries like North Korea, Somalia, and Equatorial Guinea, firing squads remain the preferred method of execution. Solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is like being grounded, except instead of 5 minutes, 5 hours in your room, it's days, months, or even years alone in a room the size of a walk-in closet. Just imagine being stuck in your room with no phone, no Netflix, and not even a knock on the door for a "how are you doing?" The only visitor is usually silent, and it's even not much of a talker. You'll spend 23 hours alone in a concrete box, and will come out for about an hour to exercise in another tiny cage. So it's kind of like going to the gym, but in isolation mode. And while it's technically supposed to help people reflect on their actions, it mostly helps them reflect on, well, the walls. However, this level of isolation does wild things to the mind. People start hallucinating, talking to themselves, and basically losing their grip on reality. So controversies started popping up here and there, like acne on a teenager's face. Because of the psychological toll solitary confinement takes on prisoners, mental health advocates and psychologists have labeled it as a cruel practice, like sending someone on the world's most miserable, endless staycation. It does more to crack a person than to rehabilitate them, leaving inmates feeling like they've been ghosted by the whole world. Chemical castration. Chemical castration might probably sound like some futuristic medical procedure, but it's actually not a surgery. It's a regular dose of medication that basically puts certain desires on permanent snooze mode. Think of it like your hormones getting a do not disturb sign, where testosterone levels are lowered so that, well, let's just say the urge to merge cools down significantly. This method of punishment is used in some places for sex offenders, and while supporters agree it's an effective way to prevent re-offending without jail, opponents say it doesn't address any underlying issues. It just hits the body's off switch, like pulling the battery out of a misbehaving robot. Then there's the issue with the meds that come with side effects like mood swings, weight gain, and a constant bleakness that rivals a rainy Tuesday. So this makes it feel a bit like turning someone's body into a twisted science experiment they never asked for, which violates bodily autonomy and human rights. Despite these controversies, some supporters believe they're on the right track. Many nations, including South Korea, are embracing chemical castration as a method of punishment, especially for individuals with a tendency to re-offend. It's a topic that continues to spark debate, much like whether pineapple belongs on pizza, except with far more serious implications. 3 strikes laws. For 3 strikes laws, the idea is simple. Commit 3 offenses, no matter how minor, and it's a one-way ticket to long-term prison. It's meant to be tough love, but in practice, it's more like bringing a sledgehammer to a pillow fight. Under these laws, if you get caught shoplifting twice, and then let's say you swipe a Snickers bar on a hungry day, that 3rd strike could land you with a life sentence, or at least 25 years. So you'd end up doing serious time for minor three-peat crimes. Now, this punishment method was introduced in the US to put the brakes on repeat offenders, but things got controversial quickly. Basically, the laws threw fairness and logic right out the window, which, seems like something the law should actually be about. Because 3 strikes uses a one-size-fits-all nature, it leaves no room for judges to consider unique circumstances or the severity of each crime. It's like slapping a full-body cast on a paper cut instead of being reserved for dangerous criminals. It often winds up punishing minor offenders way more harshly than necessary. The 3 strikes laws caused prisons to overflow like a soda left under the fountain. California's prisons were so packed that the U.S. Supreme Court had to intervene, calling the situation cruel and unusual. Plus, it costs a fortune to keep non-violent offenders behind bars for life, so some states decided to tweak things a bit, making it so that the 3 strikes rule only applies to violent felonies rather than any and every felony under the sun. Corporal punishment in schools. If your school teacher has ever flogged you with a ruler or a piece of wood, you've had a front row seat to corporal punishment. Corporal punishment in schools is basically the old school way of disciplining students by physical means, such as paddling, spanking, or a good old-fashioned smack to keep kids in line. It's quite literally the hands-on approach to teaching kids a lesson. For a long time, it was seen as the go-to way to keep order in the classroom, but these days it's one of the most debated topics in education. Some people argue that smacking kids into good behavior is like trying to put out a fire by adding more flames. You're aiming for respect, but it often just breeds fear, resentment, or even aggression, so it doesn't actually improve behavior, and even research has shown that it can lead to trust issues, depression, and anxiety, because honestly, getting whacked in math class doesn't exactly build warm, fuzzy feelings toward learning. Imagine trying to learn while worrying about dodging a ruler. Also, corporal punishment in schools is way too easy for a light punishment to cross the line into actual harm, which is a lawsuit just waiting to pop up like an unwelcome pop quiz. As a result, 128 countries, including all of Europe, Japan, Canada, South Africa, and New Zealand, have banned corporal punishment in schools, but it's still legal in some US states and most African countries. So while some see it as old-fashioned tough love, others think it's a classroom relic best left in the history books, right next to chalkboards and rotary phones. Boot camps for juveniles. So your teenage son has been keeping late nights. He's not obeying your curfew, and he talks back at you. But the straw that broke the camel's back was when you found a cigarette butt in his room. You decided not to take matters into your own hands anymore, and just shipped him off to boot camp for juveniles, where he'd be disciplined and taught some manners through some good old military training. Now, this place is basically like a military makeover for troubled teens. It's all about strict schedules, marching drills, push-ups, and screaming, "Yes, sir," at the top of your lungs to become disciplined, respectful, and maybe sweat out that rebellious streak. It's kind of like trying to turn a problem child into a model soldier, one drill sergeant yell at a time. However, it is all the intense training and tough environment that makes boot camps for juveniles so controversial. Some people think that the camps are more about scaring kids than helping them. Alright, maybe a month of 5 a.m. roll calls might teach punctuality, but research shows that a lot of these boot camps do little to address the deeper reasons behind the bad behavior. It's like slapping a band-aid on a broken leg and calling it good. The camp's focus on discipline over rehabilitation is like trying to fix a leaky pipe with a sledgehammer. It ends up making things worse. Instead of straightening out behavior, it leaves teenagers more traumatized than transformed, with psychological scars to match. Shock probation. So you finally had time to stream the horror movie your friend recommended 3 days ago. Although you're a huge fan, the first 10 minutes of this movie were so terrifying, intense, and uncomfortable that you immediately stopped watching it. Now, that's kind of the idea behind shock probation. It's basically giving an offender a quick taste of prison life where you'd experience zero freedom, constant supervision, cramped spaces, and a daily schedule that doesn't leave room for Netflix binges or even a decent nap. And if you love privacy and good food, consider both gone when you step foot inside a prison. You'd basically be sharing everything from your shower time to your emotional breakdowns, and the food range from barely edible to downright mysterious. You'd be kept here for a few weeks or months, with the hope of scaring you into becoming a good person when you're finally released on probation. While this method of punishment is intended to shock an offender into staying out of trouble, critics argue that a quick trip to Trauma Town might do more harm than good and cause some psychological damage to some extent. So instead of transforming an offender into a model citizen, it could leave them stressed, scared, and more resentful than reformed. It's like jumping into a freezing pool, but instead of getting used to it, you just get hit with one icy blast and think, "Oh, never doing that again." Civil death penalty, loss of rights post-conviction. Let's say you just finished a marathon, but instead of receiving a medal, you're banned from running in any future races, entering the track, or even wearing running shoes again. That's basically the essence of the civil death penalty. It's when certain rights and privileges remain permanently out of your reach, even long after serving time. It's like the world's worst participation award. The goal of this punishment is to protect society and reduce risks, but in reality, it's basically like getting a forever penalty. You can't vote, you're blocked from applying for certain jobs, housing options shrink faster than ice cream on a hot day, and even getting basic licenses becomes a quest worthy of an adventure movie. It's as if you've got a lifetime subscription to restrictions you never signed up for. This has led to some heated debates, hotter than a chili eating contest. On one hand, some people support the idea, thinking it's a necessary step for safety. On the other hand, critics argue that it's a punishment that just keeps giving, long after someone's debt to society has supposedly been paid. It's like finishing detention, only to find you're banned from prom, the yearbook, and any school clubs permanently. These ongoing restrictions can make re-entering society feel like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. It often leads to a cycle of struggles that ironically increases the chance of committing another crime. Talk about a plot twist nobody wanted: forced labor in prisons. Imagine being handed a job where you work long hours, don't get a say in the tasks, and make barely enough for a candy bar at the end of the day. That's the setup for forced labor in prisons, where inmates work in various roles like making license plates or firefighting for cents on the dollar, with little choice in the matter. This punishment is basically like signing up for the world's worst unpaid internship, except you didn't really sign up at all. The worst part is that it is often marketed as rehabilitation or job training, but honestly, this kind of work experience comes with a lot more chains than chances for a big break. The controversy here is twofold. First, there's the low pay, or no pay at all, which many argue is exploitative, especially when prisoners are producing goods and services that generate revenue. It's like working a 9-to-5 where you barely make enough for a cup of coffee, if coffee were allowed. Then there's the issue of consent. It's not like prisoners are given a choice here, it's volunteer work, in the same way a cat volunteers for a bath. Critics essentially tag forced labor in prisons as modern-day slavery and abuse of human rights. The Spanish boot, crushing the foot. So it's the 16th century in Spain, and your neighbor claims you stole their prized goat in the dead of the night, but you deny this accusation, and instead of facing a judge, a couple of soldiers walk you into a dirty, dimly lit cell to get to the bottom of it. Next thing you know, your hands and legs are tied, and they're clamping a strange metal shoe onto your lower leg. Then come the screws, which are twisted tighter, causing your bones to start cracking like walnuts as they grill you about that poor goat. Now, this metal shoe is the Spanish boot, which might sound like a stylish new footwear line, but it's a medieval torture device to make even the toughest toes curl. It was basically the 16th century version of a truth serum, except it wasn't sipping tea, it was bone-crushing agony. But while it was certainly effective, it became highly controversial for its excruciating brutality. This punishment wasn't just a slap on the wrist, but a full-on smash to the legs, leaving victims in unimaginable pain and often unable to walk permanently. Critics argue the Spanish boot had little to do with justice and more with inflicting as much agony as possible to force confessions, whether true or false. Garat. If you've ever had to wear a tie very close to your neck and tight, to keep up with appearance, then you can easily imagine what garat feels like. Except instead of a silk tie, it's a metal collar clamped around your neck and tightened by a screw until, breathing becomes impossible. The garat was the silent killer of punishment methods, but not in any sleek ninja kind of way. Sometimes it delivered a quick twist, but more often it was a painfully slow squeeze, giving a whole new meaning to the phrase choking up. Instead of keeping things swift and subtle, the garat became infamous for turning executions into drawn-out horror shows, sparking controversy over its downright cruel and inhumane nature. Critics viewed it as more similar to torture than execution, with the slow tightening of the collar inflicting an immense level of pain and horror. And once you were in the collar, there was no escape. Basically, the garat was the ultimate one-size-fits-all punishment. Whether you swiped a loaf of bread or led a rebellion, you were getting the same neck-tightening treatment. It's the equivalent of using a sledgehammer to open a jar, only with far scarier consequences. For these reasons, and due to its barbaric nature, the garat gradually fell out of favor and was officially banned in the 1970s. Necklacing. To paint you a picture of necklacing, imagine the necklace around your neck is swapped out for a flaming rubber tire. Instead of a bit of sparkle, you've got thick black smoke choking your lungs and blinding you, while the fire slowly cooks your neck, face, and eventually the rest of you. Not exactly a fashion statement. This brutal punishment was used a whole lot in South Africa during the apartheid era, often directed at political opponents or suspected informants. This was no light tap on the shoulder. It was a fiery public spectacle meant to scare everyone into submission, leaving no doubt that this neck accessory was designed to make an unforgettable and terrifying statement. Critics saw necklacing as nothing more than a cruel, barbaric torture designed to silence and terrify. The public spectacle aspect made it even worse, turning punishment into a blazing horror show, with fear as the main attraction.